Hello, welcome. Welcome. Hi, thank you for joining the Brooklyn Rail's 821st New Social Environment. I'm Carolyn, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the extreme pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Doreen Ríos, Tina Rivers-Ryan, Margaret Wertheim, Mashinka Ferenc-Hakopian, Kay Watson, Clara Chewei-Pei, and Charlotte Kent. And we will conclude with a poetry reading. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we're speaking from. And now to introduce today's guests and host. Doreen A. Ríos is an independent curator and researcher, founder and director of MATERIA, an online platform dedicated to the research and exhibition of digital art, post-digital practices, and new materialities in Mexico. Dr. Tina Rivers-Ryan is a renowned expert on the history of media art. As curator at the Buffalo AKG Art Museum, her exhibitions include 2022's Peer-to-Peer, the first US museum survey of artists engaged with blockchain technologies, and 2021's Difference Machines, Technology and Identity in Contemporary Art. Margaret Wertheim is a science writer and artist. She is the author of The Pearly Gates of Cyberspace, A History of Space from Dante to the Internet, and 6 other books. She and her sister, Christine Wertheim, are co-creators of the Crochet Coral Reef, the world's largest art and science project, shown at the 58th Venice Biennale, Helsinki Biennial, and many other venues. Mashinka Ferenc-Hakopian is an Armenian writer, artist, and researcher born in Yerevan and residing in Glendale, California. She is an associate professor in technology and social justice at Art Center College of Design. She is the co-editor of the Spring 2023 Art Papers issue on AI with Sarah Higgins. Her book, The Institute for Other Intelligences, was released by X Artists Book in 2022. Kay Watson is a researcher, producer, and curator working with art and advanced technologies, photography, and video games. She is currently head of arts technologies at Serpentine, where she leads the art and technology program. Clara Chewei-Pei is an independent curator and arts writer from Singapore. Her recent curated projects include Art Dubai Digital, UAE Proof of Concept, Co-Museum and Appetite Singapore, and Generating/Iterating the Upside Space Singapore, all 2023. She is also the founder of NFT Asia, an artist collective in Web3. And our host today, Associate Professor of Visual Culture at Montclair State University, Dr. Charlotte Kent, has a particular interest in historical frameworks for art practices with a research focus on contemporary digital culture and the absurd. We are lucky to have her as an editor-at-large for the Brooklyn Rail. And thank you all so much for joining today, and I'll turn it over to you, Charlotte.
Huzzah! I am so excited for this conversation. This has been just simply an extraordinary experience of having you all and the other contributors to the critics page for the May issue this year on the topic of art and technology. I was thrilled when the Rail invited me, and I was thrilled when I was thinking of who were the people I most wanted to hear from, who inspire my own thinking and have forced me to think harder and have made me look at projects I wouldn't have known about otherwise, to invite these voices. So to now be in conversation with some of you with whom I've only been able to exchange emails, I hope it's a joy for everyone else, as I know it will be for me. For the audience who might not have yet read the critics page of the Brooklyn Rail this month, I want to explain that my approach to the concept of the art and technology, because it's such a vast space with so many discourses and so many excitements and complaints, icky words and confusing words, was simply to ask each of the contributors if they would contribute a brief essay on a word that they think needs to be emphasized more in the context of this conversation, or one they would like to see never again. So with that in mind, I also wanted to offer it to the audience. So in the chat, if you feel like there's a word that's been on your mind that you think needs to be out there more, or a word that you also would like to never see again, please feel free to share it. You're welcome to explain it or not. I just thought it'd be fun to keep collecting the words as a group endeavor. But with that, I thought I would ask each of these speakers whose biographies you've now heard and are so extensive to actually just briefly introduce your entry into the world of art and technology, that linkage. So as, for example, mine was about 12 years ago, and part of my work on graduate school, I started thinking about surveillance culture because of the Homeland Security tag, if you see something, say something. And that phrasing made me start thinking about how we write about art, but also made me start looking at projects where artists were dealing with surveillance, which brought me into the world of many digital art projects and thinking through of technology. And that's how I find myself some dozen years later here. So what about the rest of you? How did you find yourself thinking about art and technology and jumping into it? I'm not going to call on you. It's not school.
Shall I go first? Because I don't know how to answer. Sorry, Doreen, were you about to go?
No, you go first. It's fine.
I think it's such a difficult one to answer, because this is why I chose a term that was quite complicated, because I think also my route into this world has sort of been, I've never sort of had a single trajectory in my career or life really at all. So I'd say that there are two ways that I came into this. I used to, I came to art and technology through photography. I studied and worked as a curator, working very specifically with photography, and photography always interested me as something that was quite hard to define. And that exists, the same image or the same can exist in multiple places at the same time and mean multiple different things. It's difficulty to understand it as status as an artwork or any of these statuses that we choose to give things. And the other was, I was an archivist for many years. I used to build databases for a number of different photographers for the archiving of their work. I worked with a number of photographers who emerged in the 90s, who didn't have any interest in archiving their work until I would say like 15, 20 years ago, when legacy and all of these things started to change. So I came into it as, like, technically speaking, around building the infrastructure, and then just sort of, yeah, working through photography, but then also as a producer. So that is a very messy way of saying that was my way into art and technology. Yeah.
I don't think you're the only one who probably has a messy entry, but others?
Yeah, I think same, Kai. I guess that my connection with art and technology started when I was doing my BA in architecture. Yeah, one way or the other, when I was studying university, one of the things that they shared with us the most, and that was kind of like the thing for this particular school to be at, is that we got taught a lot of software, but that's not casual. Let's say, well, I grew up, I'm not from Mexico City, I'm currently based in Mexico City, but I'm from a smaller town up the mountains, which is very much known for being an industrial city. So the relationship with machines is pretty close. My dad is an engineer, and pretty much everyone else in my family is as well. So not necessarily connected to a cultural world just yet, but I decided to, you know, just go on and do something a tiny bit different. So I decided to become an architect because it's just a tiny bit different to being an engineer, I guess. And when I was doing architecture school, and we were thrown all of these software at, I realized that there was no specific conversation in regards to how these systems or this software was developed. When I was studying was pretty much just like, yeah, go on and use this thing. This is the next big thing that's going to solve everyone's problem, which is, of course, we know it's not necessarily the case. But I just became, you know, very interested in regards to the conversation as to how this software shifted throughout time and how does that reflected on, in this case, architecture and design. And that kind of just pushed me into a very crazy and amazing world of people working creatively with software and actually using all of these tools for things that were not necessarily architecture nor design, but something else. So yeah, I guess that's how I started, yeah, researching, I suppose, how originally how software could take the shape of something else or could allow for other kind of conversations to unfold. And that eventually led me to meet a lot of people who were working with several kinds of technology, not necessarily just software. And that's where it just kind of clicked. Yep.
I came to it pretty askance as well. My doctoral research was on artist activist media networks in the 60s and 70s, and specifically on the 1970 art strike against racism, sexism, war, and repression. And I was interested in lecture performances as a form that denaturalizes otherwise seemingly neutral modes of knowledge transmission. And once I started thinking about how knowledge was being transmitted and constructed and legitimized, that led very naturally into thinking about the kinds of knowledge that we transmit to AI models, for example, large language models, generative adversarial networks, and so forth.
I came to art and technology basically through my original career, which was, I thought I was going to be a theoretical physicist. I went to university and studied physics and mathematics, and eventually decided I wasn't going to go on to be an academic scientist. And I became a science writer and science journalist. And from the beginning in my work as a science writer, this was like in the 80s, I was very interested in the emerging intersection between art and technology, even back then, where lots of really interesting things were happening, like very, very early interactive video systems and the development of holography and various other forms of techno art practices. And I was always interested in writing about those because of my interest in science. But I really came into thinking about art and technology when 25 years ago, I wrote a book called The Pearly Gates of Cyberspace, which is a history of space from the Middle Ages to the internet. And what fascinated me about this story is that when you look at the history of Western scientific thinking about space, we think of space as just a purely conceptual thing, but actually the evolution of our understanding of space is deeply bound up with the technologies of representation, starting with the development of what I think is legitimately a technology of perspectival representation. And so when I wrote that book, which was really to reflect on the interface between how we think about space from a cultural and scientific perspective, it was very clear that, as I said, technologies of representation have played a huge role in that. And then I started to think and write and pay a lot more attention to the intersection between technology in general and the cultural sphere, including arts.
I came into sort of this sphere or this intersection because I grew up between Singapore and China. So both countries I think are extremely conscious and interested in sort of national economies, but also international exchanges and perceptions around their relationships to technology. I studied economics in my undergrad, and then gradually came into looking at Chinese contemporary art. I think a particular field where the market really helped to establish a kind of art historical narrative and field for the country and its diasporas. And because so many of the artists that I was looking at, learning about, like Tao Fei, Ye Funa, or Lawrence Leck, were naturally interested in technologies, that sort of led me to begin wanting to learn more and write about artists engaged with technologies when I started working. And gradually then came to adopt sort of different roles across the ecosystem, be it in writing, curating, research, or building a collective, because I realized that despite the fact that there are a lot of artists engaged with sort of new media or emerging technologies in Southeast Asia, there aren't really formalized sort of ecosystems and infrastructures supporting their work. So then decided to start building this collective with some other artists, focus on the Web3 space, hoping it could offer some possible alternatives for livelihoods or ways of establishing their individual practices. And I'm a bit disillusioned about all of that now, but still sort of hoping to seek out, spaces where these practices can be supported, especially in sort of not yet formalized markets like in Southeast Asia.
Ina, I think we're all going to have to get to the topic of disillusion, but before we get there, can you tell us about how you got started?
Sure. First of all, so thrilled to be on this panel with people, including Doreen and Clara, who I consider friends from the internet, but have never actually interfaced with before. So, and the rest of you guys, so excited to be able to meet you and to read your amazing contributions. So yeah, I didn't jump in to answer because my answer is quite mundane and not particularly intellectual, which is that I was a raver in the 90s. And I spent a lot of time looking at digital projections, like a lot of time looking at digital projections. For those of you familiar with Winamp's music visualization program, or for those who got a little more hardcore into that, Milk Drop. Spent a lot of time watching Milk Drop. Yeah, I never really, my conception of visual culture was sort of always mediated by the digital. And then when I went to college and had T1 access and sort of joined a generation of folks who were participating in this really exciting online distribution of media content, I don't know, man. For me, it's popular culture. I mean, it's like Chris Cunningham's music videos for Aphex Twin and Bjork, that's my entry point into the possibilities of the digital as an aesthetic or creative medium, at least, right? It's, putting aesthetic aside, let's just say creative. And then I, went and made it more academically rigorous by studying art history, and I actually was really drawn to the history of avant-garde cinema. So originally I was looking at the history of abstract and structuralist film. And from that sort of segued into time-based media. And so it's always been digital for me in my intellectual formation and also in my personal life. So
that gives a pretty good sense of about 30 years of looking at the space on the panel. We are 15 hours of time zones apart as we are on this panel. We are coming from, wildly different entry points, really different perspectives. And I think that speaks a little bit to actually one of the reasons why I wanted to come at it this way. I think in general, this is part of what's true about this space. Even that word seems a little awkward, but I'll leave it for now. There's just so many different approaches. There's so many different concerns and ways of thinking about it. So without going into the detail of your essay, when I posed this question to you and asked you to contribute, you all landed on a word, but maybe could you share if there were other words that you had in mind that you debated or if there was, you know, a really strong reason why you landed on the word that you did, personal or intellectual, as if there were a difference, but that aside. Tina, we'll start with you since you just ended.
Sure. I was about to say, I'm really happy to jump in on this one. So first of all, it was sort of amazing to see, I mean, perhaps unsurprising, but still exciting to see how many words showed up on the list that I myself had considered. So for example, public or publics, which Kay wrote about so wonderfully, and I think arrived at the same conclusion I did, which is that we just need to be, well, anyway, I don't want to speak for what Kay said, but yes, it's a really key word that we need to all be thinking about, right? And making sure that we're not taking that word for granted. Metaverse was another one that I, had considered, which Margaret wrote about. I wound up talking about aesthetics, just to answer the second part of your question, Charlotte, because we are in this moment in which there have been a number of high-profile museum exhibitions dedicated to art and technology, or digital art more specifically. And the critics have been out for blood. Some of them, a lot of them. And it's been sort of amazing to see this critical discourse around digital art that in many ways echoes the critical discourse that happened 50 years ago, 60 years ago. And I was just feeling a bit frustrated. Like, it's funny because, I'm, as a curator, I'm somebody who's very interested in the politics of technology and about thinking about technology as being indivisible from its socio-historical context, right? As a social art historian, this is something that Magda brought up really beautifully, I think, in her essay on the word neutral, right? Like understanding that no, technology is not neutral. And this is something I believe very passionately. And then I chose the word aesthetics. I did a complete 180 because I feel like we've spent so much time talking about the politics of technology and situating it sort of in this like social political context. And yet we sort of forget, and by we, I mean some type of traditional mainstream contemporary art world, we forget that we're also talking about art, right? And so I, my desire to talk about aesthetics was just to sort of, really in response to, as a result of a frustration with the dialogue right now, which was completely dismissing the aesthetic quality of these works, or even refusing to even consider that they had an aesthetic dimension. And so wanting to bring that back into the conversation. But yeah, I could have easily written about any of these other words. They're all very important words to consider. So it's a great page.
I'm happy to jump in. I had a laundry list that included things like innovation, technoscientific progress, creativity, invention, and so forth. So all of the terminology that serves as the kind of like machinery of the techno-capitalist drive to frame all of this as radically new, radically different from anything we've ever seen before, the first of its kind. And then I thought, why fill in the negative space when I'd be thinking about what it is that I would like to see instead. And then on a more personal note, my project right now, the book project I'm working on is on ancestral intelligence as a kind of antidote to the hyper novelty that we're seeing, both, I think, in the kind of like popular arts discourse and also in the more critical discourse around work that's being algorithmically enabled through GANs and through LLMs.
I also considered doing both innovation and creativity, both of which are words I would like to see expunged from discourse overall. If I hear the word creativity again, I'll shoot someone. But I, like Mashinka, I also felt like I wanted to not just focus on something negative, but to sort of point out that there had been, that there are real positives by looking back in history. And one of the things I think goes through a lot of our essays is a rejection of the idea that novelty is ipso facto, the sine qua non of artistic advancement, as it were. And it struck me how many of us have mentioned the importance of the past, the importance of traditional ways of knowing. And on that note, Marx once said a really interesting thing that I think is absolutely critical for us to think about today. In the mid-19th century, Marx said that one of the functions of new technologies was to separate the generations from one another. And he obviously regarded that as a socially disruptive, in a bad way, sense. And I think that one of the things that a lot of us are trying to do is to say that the discourse around technology doesn't have to be divisive. And I think, from my point of view of being someone who's interested in the history of science, I think that we see this pattern again and again and again, where not just new technologies are discovered, but new scientific theories are come up with. That there's this wholesale kind of saying, this is the future, this is going to change the fundamental structure of human society, and that everything in the past has been retrograde, and now we're going to transcend that. And I think it's incredibly politically important that we collectively resist that.
Yeah, I would love to expand a tiny bit on that, because I think that in a way my contribution also taps into this conversation. Well, I got complex, which is a very abstract thing to think about, I guess, but it definitely did connect with world building or ancestral, or even, rethinking other ways of connecting with the notion that we have of technology. And there was a specific provocation that kind of ended up being the reason why I chose to develop a series of haikus on these images that are somewhere in between data visualization and these images in the process of becoming something else that I thought was really interesting. And this kind of connects a lot with a conversation that I had with a writer and researcher that I really, really admire, Monica Nepote. And I remember talking with Monica at some point in regards to the histories of technology, or how we understand technology from, different perspectives. And we were talking about how in a lot of Mesoamerican cultures, specifically regarding like a moment prior to colonization, the first technology was language, or the first technology that we acknowledge as being a technology is language, and how important that is in terms of how we think about the notion of innovation within technology in itself, no? And we talked a lot about that, and how if language was the first technology for a lot of these Mesoamerican cultures, whereas for other, let's say, more Occidental thinking, could be more like the development or the manipulation of fire, that really allows you to think where we are in terms of like the disconnection of regarding language as the first technology in comparison to regarding the manipulation of fire as the first technology, and the exchange that we have in terms of power and in terms of like imposing certain kind of narrative of innovation and progress. And that's definitely one of the conversations that we have a lot when we rethink this moment of colonization, right? Like, I think that the narratives in regards to progress are something that is just like deeply, deeply rooted in this notion of extracting or eliminating certain kind of practices. And in this case, a lot of the technologies that were developed through language. So I really kind of wanted to go back into thinking about these, like these complex relationships and the complexities of understanding art and technology practices nowadays, but then also the complexities and the contradictions as well in regards to how we build these, these notions of how we can think art and technology working together for, on one hand, maybe just, kind of pushing a certain narrative or narratives that are useful for capitalist and colonization purposes, but then on the other hand, being able to hack all of these notions through an artistic practice as well. So I kind of wanted to do something that was also very different for me, because I don't really fully engage with creative writing, but I try to give it a go and just see, how can we put all of these, intuitions together in terms of like rethinking why this complex, of course, and contradictory relationship with technology is super, super interesting nowadays, especially when we're at a moment where I think we can start creating other kind of exchanges and relationships in between, where we see developing and unfolding currently through well, a lot of practices, of course, but in here kind of like focusing on the discourses that we've been seeing in the past, I think at least 10 years or so, in regards to reconnecting with these, say, ancestral technologies, but also acknowledging what technology actually is or could be in regards to this discourse. So, yeah.
Extending from what Doreen is saying, I went with the word world building. I think out of this impulse that I'm just very sort of disappointed. I think a lot of the sort of immersive environments and experiences that we've seen that, are being invested on really are sort of extensions of the world that we already live in, and that continue the economic and political structures that we all know are, kind of broken, but are also what are being funded on. And really thinking about a big reason for sort of why I was so interested in sort of virtual world building or digital practices that engage with these notions is because of how I think a lot of the artists that I work with, coming from sort of developing countries or sort of less formulated sort of art ecosystems, have utilized these spaces as routes or just opportunities to imagine sort of alternative ways of being, whether that's like taking, gravity out of the way, or reimagine completely different kinds of economic structures, or like Chong Yan, whose work I referenced, push sort of techno-capitalism to an extreme, to imagine a very dystopic sort of society, dystopic like KL in Malaysia, where, data or your digital cache is what you are trading for the government that has established a monopoly of the food supply, so on and so forth. So really then wanting to focus on in what ways have some of the artists been looking at this as an opportunity to really reimagine, but also bring into question our present, and to sort of open up conversations on like futurities. But another word that I sort of discussed with Charlotte is on glitch. And I wasn't really sure if glitch was the right word, but it was coming out of this realization and learning of, exactly how unequal access to working in media art, both on the hardware and software level, is for a lot of the artists in the sort of NFT Asia, this collective I'm part of. That's down to whether it's like unstable Wi-Fi, or it's the ability to purchase softwares, or what does it mean when you don't have stable sort of electricity, and how all of that affects your workflow. Rimbawan, whom I also referenced briefly in the final contribution, has talked a bit about how, he isn't able to sort of gain access to these softwares and hardwares that can perhaps allow his work to be at the same level as someone that, has a massive studio, can sort of outsource, whether it's rendering power or otherwise. And so he embraces that and accepts a sort of lower quality, lower resolution nature of what he's been working on, but also pushes it to an extreme so that it almost becomes quiche, and really thinks about what it then means to hack his way around these softwares. But yeah, also before ending off, I just want to say that I really loved Mashinka's contribution on ancestral. I think it really touched me deeply to think about all the different kinds of intelligences as well that are being deprioritized and deprivileged, with the ways in which we are looking at sort of understandings of intelligences in this moment. But yeah.
Thank you so much, Clara.
Am I last to go? Quite difficult to follow on from all of these points, and I think I was really it was really interesting when I saw the final list of contributions, and how brilliantly they all fit together, and I must say, Mashinka, I did also really feel like there's like a really good grounding in the way that ancestral sort of feeds the rest of the contributions. but in terms of how I went about choosing a term, I must say I did have a mild existential crisis while trying to think of the term, because there are so many, it's such a complicated space, and trying to kind of position one narrative, one word to sort of position that narrative succinctly. And of course, you know, we had to just, you know, force myself to just go in one direction rather than trying to talk about everything all at the same time. But for me, I chose the word public because it was really trying to like focus on how I and we function as an institution, and who it's for, why we do this work, but also really trying as well, and I think Tina, you do this as well, which is trying to get away from this kind of idea of tech for the sake of tech. You know, and maybe we come at that. I thought it was a really interesting way, Tina, that you approached talking about aesthetics, but also then saying that, you know, that kind of medium specificity can breed a different kind of unhelpful approach to talking about art and technology. I think it's also worth saying I'm writing this from a UK context, where the institution I work in is considered public. It is a public institution, but the sort of public funding, which we're also very fortunate to have, has been decimated in the last, you know, 20, 30 years. And so we do really have to reevaluate that kind of, in an institutional sense, particularly in the UK, what it means to be a public institution, because it's not really straightforward anymore. A public institution is private and public at the same time. And I think that other words, I've definitely been thinking about community, and I'm very glad that I didn't choose community, because I think there's an interesting relationship between public and community. I'm interested in a word like production, because I think it's also something that's slightly undervalued in, from my perspective, I think it's often been undervalued in a contemporary art context, but that how you build, I think, is so important. And innovation, of course. I was very glad to see that my colleagues Ruth and Penny made such an excellent contribution to that, because, you know, it's become such a key driver of funding, particularly actually forms of public funding in the UK, in addition to sort of broader narratives. And I guess another final one was really accessibility, actually, because I think that's also another very complicated point when you get into, you know, anything from geopolitics to just really basic notions of accessibility in relation to technologies, because I think it's particularly from a kind of funding perspective in the UK, it's been, you know, digital has, or whatever technologies has equaled accessibility, and we know it doesn't really work like that. So yeah, that's sort of been my route in, but I do think it was such an excellent idea to bring together this group of people around these kind of really short, sort of direct pieces of writing around how we, because it's such a hard to define area. And I work in it every day and I still can't define it.
I mean, I think it's difficult, right? Because most of you with whom I've spoken, we don't even like the words we use to describe what it is we're doing. We don't like art and technology. We don't like digital art. We're not always comfortable with new media art. Media art seems really broad. Like computer art seems specifically of a time and place. Like, right? We're not even sure what word we want to use to describe the thing we spend most of our lives or days thinking about. And one of the things that came across as you were speaking, but also in the writing, was just the way in which there's a struggle with the necessity to have words specify, to be able to use them to be specific about what we're intending and what we're trying to share. And at the same time, wanting to not overdetermine, right? And trying to find ways in which these words retain some kind of looseness or ability to grow. And certainly I struggle with that all the time. And so I was wondering if there were, especially as you all are scholars and curators, and so regularly having to communicate to use Kay's word, publics, right? And to cultivate certain types of engagements and thinking and so forth. How do you deal with the fact that, and not to get over theoretical here, but like, language is a structure, it's an intentional structure, it needs to be specific, and at the same time its specificity is constantly slipping away as words get used. I mean, Margaret, that was specifically what you were trying to deal with the word metaverse and why you were reinforcing the word cyberspace. When we're looking for language the way we're looking for, do any of you, like, what are you thinking about how we deal with this moment where we need words and the words are also not serving us?
Charlotte, I would love to jump in on this question. I think it's so key because I write about science and have been doing for a very long time. This question of how you use language in relation to newness comes up all the time in science because, whole part of the job of being a science writer is to describe to people new concepts, new theories, new ideas that are coming into being. And I think this gets to an issue that Tina raises really well, I think, in her piece, which is she makes the point that art and technology tends to be something that's considered a bastard child. It's not embraced by the art world really fully. Often it's not embraced by the technology or science world fully. And so you get this sort of bastard child, art and technology, and of which I would also say the same thing applies to art and science. And I think being someone who comes from a background in science and now from an academic science background and now trying to communicate to the public, I think this is a very difficult task that we face as communicators. And part of what I see that I think is problematic, and I think it gets to the heart of your question, is that when people are trying to describe these new systems, whether they're science, technology, or art and science, or art and technology, there's this really big tendency to fall back on these sort of dreadful omnibus words like complex, innovative, creative, as if somehow nothing in the history of the world before has been complex, innovative, or creative. And, what I think is the real challenge, or one of the big challenges that we have, is how can we talk about these new developments without lapsing into this kind of what I would call, advertising speak. Like, not everything in the world is an earth-shattering transformation of human culture. And I see art and technology people and art and science people, I think the biggest mistake I see is this overclaiming that how transformative this is. And I think that there's too much getting bound up in these cycles of hype, and that it should be mandated that everybody has to write about what they're doing or what they're trying to express without using a whole list. There should be a whole list of words that are actually off the agenda. You can't use innovation, you can't use creative, you can't use transformative. And part of what it does, if you stop using those words all the time, A, you get away from so much hype, but B, you're forced to actually clarify, what do I actually mean here? What is it that's so-called innovative, creative, transformative? Don't use those omnibus words which have become totally meaningless in our culture today. Let's try and be more specific.
I'll just add interesting to that list. I find the word interesting to be meaningless.
Yes.
Unless it's meant in the very specific sense of it continues to add increased value, which is most of the time how people aren't using it. I mean, I feel like that's one of the things, Tina, you were trying to get at with your essay on aesthetics, right? And that, you know, why do we select the works that we want to write about or curate into shows or present, right? Because when we experience them, there's an experience, right? That there's a sensibility that has occurred. And it does seem as if there's been such a focus either on, you know, and the content is important, right? Like I want to emphasize content interests me. Like I like work that has content and concepts and things to think about. But at the same time, that alone often feels really dogmatic, right? It feels like I'm just being given some kind of propaganda work because it's just sort of, you know, banging on about some idea. And in which case I sort of often want to be like, well, can I just read the essay about this instead? Or the manifesto or something, which I love manifestos, you know, that would be great for me. So there's this balance that has to occur when we're talking about art, right? There has to be this way in which it's producing some kind of sensible experience that is putting me into this something, and concepts that I'm sort of sifting through. I'm putting that out there to like others' response, thoughts.
I mean, I think, Charlotte, you know, at the very beginning of your introduction to the critics page, you talk about our need for words, right? But in order to make things sensible, we need heuristics, we need taxonomies, we need, you know, language to sort of make meaning. And yet the fact that, at least with the visual arts, right, there will always be a tension, right? Because language and visual form are not totally mapped onto each other in a transparent, unmediated kind of way. I don't know if I can answer the second question you just put on the table, but I did want to sort of go back to the original question about this you know, question about language and the difficulty of the slipperiness of some of the terminology. And maybe I can try to loop this back into the point you were just making about sort of like sensible experience. So, you know, it's something I definitely struggle with because I've never met an artist who wants to be called a digital artist or a new media artist. They all just want to be artists or contemporary artists. And so how do I identify the area, the arena of contemporary art in which I am particularly interested in? And how do I sort of name and talk about those artists who are asking the kinds of questions that I'm most interested in, right? And I found that even that gets slippery because some of the artists who I think are making the most interesting kind of statements about technology are like painters using acrylic or oil on canvas, right? So how do we define these terms? And so I've sort of, my workaround to this, right, which is maybe a bit cheating, is to say that like, the point is the slipperiness, right? And that some of the most interesting work, like you're saying, how do we choose like which things we want to talk about or curate or whatever, are precisely those artistic projects, artistic practices that sort of destabilize things further and then maybe propose new configurations, right? And so this is something else that actually just came up in a review that I have coming out this summer, you know, where I think some of the most interesting digital art, let's say, you know, may not be legible as art or as aesthetic to certain audiences because they are falling back on sort of received notions or traditional paradigms of what aesthetic experience is or should look like. And like, you're sort of missing the point because the whole point, I think, of some of these practices is that they challenge, they expand our notion of what aesthetics is and can be. And in fact, if you look at the history of modern and contemporary art, you know, we used to not think that a word slapped on a wall in vinyl was a visual artwork, right? But then like, thank you, Lawrence Weiner, now that's a thing that we recognize as a visual experience. So I just think that, you know, it's not so much like we have to pin down and narrowly define all of these words. I think we have to understand that these words are perhaps most exciting when they are sort of fluid, dynamic, destabilized. And I'm very, very scared after Margaret's comments right before mine to invoke something like disruption, right? But I am very interested in those artists who don't just innovate for the sake of innovating, or disrupt for the sake of disruption, but who are sort of helping us understand that the world in which we live, aesthetic experience might look radically different, right? Like it doesn't make sense to me that aesthetic experience, now that I have a smartphone that basically is never out of my hand, that aesthetic experience should be modeled after what was presented at the salons of the 19th century. It just doesn't make sense. So yeah, sorry, that was elliptical. I don't know if I totally circled back to where you were going, but I did want to say that about words, right? That it's what I'm trying to say is it's okay if these words aren't, are sort of slippery and all language is context dependent, right? And it's always just a matter of defining your terms before you make your claim, right? Like, what do we mean when we say public? What do we mean when we say digital? What do we mean when we say art, right? And that I think one of the great things artists do are to constantly force us to sort of reevaluate and redefine not only our terms, but then as a corollary of that, like the critical stakes of the conversation.
And I think that's super interesting because, well, grading, of course, in this for this particular invitation in English for me, where my regular normal maternal language is Spanish, sometimes it just kind of disconnects from all of these notions as well of what certain words might mean and where. And actually it was just like getting back to a question that is just right here on the chat regarding the perspective of Rosalind Krauss and Clement Greenberg in regards to intermedia works. And one of the things that I find very interesting here is that, for instance, when thinking about media in this conversation, this particular conversation, media is connected to the Aristotelian sense, which basically means a technique, whereas in a lot of the conversations that we're having in here, media does not necessarily regard or connect directly to the notion of the technique. It connects to a Newtonian sense, for instance, of thinking about media as in a communication exchange, right? Like the ways in which certain messages get, I don't know, like connected or shared or distributed. And I think that's something that's very interesting as well when thinking about this specificity of using certain words. Because of course, thinking about, the digital or thinking about innovation or technology or media, or you call it, what we're focusing on in here is, of course, just one way of understanding these definitions, because if we were looking into other conversations, held in other languages, something that I've always found very interesting is how in French you would say art numérique, no? Like in order to call a certain kind of production that has to do with sometimes, yes, digital practices, but in others that it can expand into other areas. And going back into this very abstract and very specific notion of the complex, I think it's more about rethinking this particular intent and kind of like reading that through a broader context. And it's always going to come down to this situated knowledge. And I think that's what's very powerful and very impactful in these kind of exchanges. And I think that it just even goes beyond kind of, I don't know, like trying to get a hold of what a certain word means, because of course this is going to be something that's going to be fluid and changing throughout time. And that's the reason why I think it's so powerful to think about language as being one of these core key essential technologies, right? Because it's always been, I don't know, I guess it's always been fluid. And I think that allows for other kind of conversations to unfold over there. And of course, having these critical conversations in regards as to how we talk about these kind of practices, but not only from within one specific language. How does that actually interact with other notions, right? Like I think about, I don't know, like also the definition or the translation of certain words like technology that are not particularly being they cannot translate into certain languages. So what's the logic behind that? Or even art, even the word art, it cannot be translated into a lot of Mesoamerican languages, for instance. It doesn't exist in that sense. But I think that's interesting because that allows us to think like, what's the closest relationship that you can have in order to exchange this concept? How do we share that notion? So I think that there's something there that could be, I don't know, like a very vibrant part of what we're talking about in here and exchanging in here as well.
That, Doreen, makes me think of what I think of as a related point, which is it's not just the words we use, like art, and as you say, which don't necessarily exist in other languages, and in fact, which didn't exist in English either until the late 18th century. But it's who gets to use the words. And one of the things that I find to me personally, very troubling about the emergence of the art and technology sphere and the art and science sphere is that I think there's a bit of a tendency, not totally, but there is a bit of a tendency for certain kinds of people and certain kinds of art to be valorized, and that what's being valorized is decided by the people who have the cultural power at that time. And that leads me to a question I want to have for you, Charlotte, was it a concerted or conscious effort on your part to have all women contributors? Oh, well, so there's one guy, isn't there? But I'm so struck by the fact that, at least everyone here, and I think 9 out of 10 of your contributors are women, and they're all such insightful commentary. And I must say that I think it's not coincidental that such insightfulness is coming from so many women.
Well, the cat's out of the bag. It was intentional. And I thought it was really important. I mean, all of you were on any initial list I would have produced anyway. But as I thought about it, to your point and to some of what we've been talking about, it's a perception issue, right? I know so many extraordinary the stereotype of who is in this space is not most of whom I encounter in it. The complexity of the positions, most of you are coming from complex backgrounds, sorry to use the word complex again, right? But like are bringing your own intersectional touches to an intersectional topic. The perception is often that this is a really sort of it's one kind of person with one kind of ideology. I thought one of the ways to sort of break that stereotype was just to offer something different. And it wasn't that difficult. I mean, that's the thing, is there's so many women and so many female identifying people who are in this space doing extraordinary work that it wasn't as if it was difficult to find you all. It was mostly a matter of like, with all that you already do, can you fit it into your busy schedules? And you were able to do that, which was some kind of miracle to me. Somehow it has already come to the hour, and I'm realizing it's time for us to go to the opportunity for the audience to ask everyone questions as well. So I will just say, since I'm supposed to now be quiet, which is always difficult for me, this has been extraordinary, and I have learned so much and been taking notes, and I can't wait to continue these conversations with each and every one of you. But I want to give the audience a chance to dig deeper with you as well. So Carolyn, can I hand it back to you?
Yes, thank you so much. This could, really truly go on all afternoon, and that the chat has been incredible, on fire today. We have quite a lot of questions. I'm going to ask the first one on behalf of Helen Colton. So Helen asks, a word/subject in regard to technology that I would like to have more exposure is intersectionality as a relational theory/aesthetic, as seen through the perspective of feminist discourse. With this panel of all female participants, it would be great to hear more on this.
Happy to jump in on this one. I would, if you haven't encountered it already, I really love the book Data Feminism by Lauren Klein and Catherine D'Ignazio that looks very closely at exactly this, what it means to remake the world through data from an intersectional feminist perspective, with the understanding that data shapes distributions of power, and standard practices in data science and in art result in asymmetrical distributions of power. And then once we recognize that, we can begin to rearrange and reorganize what that means. And then there's a whole, host of incredible thinkers doing this work, incredible artists, researchers who are making contributions to critical media studies at the same time they're producing these absolutely staggeringly brilliant models. I won't list them here, but I'll list them in the chat. And I love this question and the way that it surfaces those contributions in the conversation. So thank you, Helen.
I just want to endorse the question and say that the very last thing I did before the COVID pandemic was present a paper at CAA, the College Art Association conference in February of 2020, that was precisely about bringing together the terms intersectionality and intermedia, using the work of Sandra Perry as my primary example. And unfortunately, that work has not been published. And frankly, I don't even think it's fully cooked, but I agree with the intuition that there's something there in terms of thinking about, peripheries and the marginal, thinking about a kind of politics that is invested in disrupting categories, which, as we know, categories are essentially the basis for forming hierarchies of power. Like the need to categorize is an Enlightenment project that goes hand in hand with the need to name and to dominate. Yeah, and I think that if you look at, not all intermedia work, obviously, is made by, people from marginalized backgrounds or deals with politics in a kind of explicit way. But I think that there is a kind of productive way that these things can be brought together. But I don't have more of an answer for you, at least not in this space. So, but I endorse the question.
I would just like to add just a tiny bit on this, because this kind of connects really well with what Tina just shared, is that fairly recently I reconnected with a book by Gloria Anzaldúa, where she reflects in regards to the figure of La Malinche. So La Malinche is this woman that in Mexico was regarded as, like, quote unquote, one of the main traders in the colonization process, because she became the translator for the colonizers. And throughout time, like, thinking about Malinche had always had like a negative background to it in Mexico, no? Like Malinche is always like the trader, and there's a lot of words like in slang words that had to do with like this Malinchismo, for instance. Malinchismo means that you do not appreciate something that's local, something that's Mexican, let's say. But then Gloria Anzaldúa, when she talks about La Malinche, she says like, well, it was very, very unfair to just, point fingers at La Malinche in terms of like she being like this main trader to the Aztec people, when actually what happened is that she was the mother of the New World. And I think that's very beautiful also to think about, in the sense that, this woman is the only one that was aware of the surroundings and what she could do with them. She knew that she could not, in a way, like fight back this domination process, but she could definitely push into saving certain kind of knowledge and certain kind of practices and certain kind of traditions, which have remained with us until today. So rethinking about the image of this woman who was able to connect, like it kind of connects me to this notion of the intermedia as well. Like she was that link, let's say, in between the old world and the new world. And I think that figure becomes very, very powerful in a lot of, symbolic and metaphoric ways, but also very literal ways in which we can see that happening as well, with a connection between art and technology, as this hybrid thing being not fully, in a way, grasped by art, but also not fully grasped by technology. So in a way, this is always like ongoing conversation of these so-called, I don't know, I guess new world or so, like not new in the sense of like thinking of in like something being new as like the main thing, but something that happens in between that might be very interesting. And for me, what represents that new world, that or this potential new world, or this mixture of things that need to be grasped from the past and then pushed into the future, it's actually the figure of La Malinche. So yeah, I don't know, it's kind of connects there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Helen, for your question and for these answers. Our next question is going to come from Andrew Wilbright, editor-at-large here at the Rail. Go ahead, Andrew. You should be able to unmute.
Charlotte, thank you so much for putting this amazing issue together. This is one of my favorite contributors pages I've read, and I really appreciate all of your contributions. I wanted to take advantage of the international group here, and I had a two-part question for any of you that want to answer it, and whichever is more interesting to you. The first is like thinking of art regionalized and bring it back to art. Are there artists that you can think of that address technology in this cosmotechnic way, or dealing with things in a specifically regional way to where you're at, that feels specific rather than like a global idea of technology, which you all talked about earlier as kind of being suspicious of? And the part two is, in America, we have like 80 years of critics being very suspicious of things that go against genre, like Clement Greenberg and Michael Fried, and even Rosalind Krauss in the October crowd. So I feel like there's a suspicion against media or anything that doesn't feel like a traditional painting or a discrete object. And I'm wondering, from a global international perspective, if there are any culprits or anything that you contribute to the hesitancy to embrace whatever it is you want to call this, which is like art and new media or technology or integration. Is there like a critical standpoint or philosophical, or is it just cultural that you feel specific to where you're coming from?
I have so much to say in response to both questions that I feel so like overwhelmed. I think maybe the first part of the question, an artist that I look to often, his name is Rimban Guerrilla, or his real name is Tri Hartono, and he comes from a VJ, underground DJ background, and he's been working in sort of digital art, or however you want to call it, 3D, creating different visuals for music or otherwise for decades. And in sort of his more recent practice, he's been sort of trying to formulate this conversation around what he called third world futurism, and he's also sort of contesting his choice of words there right now, but really thinking about what it means to reflect his daily realities, especially, that is structural and lacking in sort of cyberspace. What does it mean to represent like working class in Jakarta, Indonesia, in digital artworks, down to things like, what would it have been like if CGI had acknowledged more of its Asian sort of contributors that developed this technology? Would what we understand of CGI aesthetics today to look very different? What kinds of visual cultures could have taken up more space in just this realm in general? But also, what does it mean for us to challenge power dynamics of sort of typical art historical objects in digital media? So he has this work that's called David Kuproy, and it's basically David the sculptor, but reimagined as like an Indonesian migrant worker with slippers, with sort of tools, complete look, right? It's really sort of almost like this just toy that like he's sort of trying to invent, but it exists also as a GLB object, so a 3D object that's interactive. And so you're also, in a way, rethinking what is your relationship then with this sculpture as you can zoom in, zoom out, twirl it around, viewing it in your own space. So Rimban is someone that I'm really interested in, and I think he's so brilliant, he doesn't even know it. And it's also interesting because he comes from this sort of more commercial backgrounds, who's leaning into the more conceptual and critical aspects, I think, of his practice, but maybe not yet with the language or the frameworks that, you know, one often uses within the sort of media art space. And it's also an issue that I think in Indonesia or broadly in Southeast Asia, there are very few critics or writers or curators that focus on intersections of art and technology that can support sort of artists on a more systematic level. And that's, I think, broadly because Southeast Asia as a whole is also preoccupied with, you know, whether Southeast Asian art history is even a thing, is this even a framework, and other sorts of questions that are very different from, let's say, like Western art history. But yeah, before I sort of ramble on forever.
There's an artist in Australia called Lynette Walworth who does extraordinary immersive VR projects where she specifically projects things onto a 3D dome. And she made what I think is one of the most amazing pieces of VR I've ever seen. That is about, it's a real story about an Aboriginal man in the 1950s who lived on land in Central Australia where the British dropped atomic bombs. Many people don't know, but Central Australia was also used as a testing ground for atomic bombs by the British, and it was considered terra nullius by the British, of course. But Aboriginal people lived there, and she made this extraordinary virtual reality film about this encounter with this Aboriginal man who's now about 100 and still alive, and the dropping of the atomic bomb. And I think it's one of the most important VR works I've ever seen, and in part because what it is doing is it's not trying to be, as it were, a fantasy experience. It's truly immersing you in a documentary experience of what life in another culture was like. So she goes to the land of this man, where, you know, the people don't speak English, they just speak Pitjantjatjara. And it's probably the most moving and powerful VR experience I've ever seen. And at the end of it, she simulates the dropping of the atomic bomb and what these people actually experienced. And it's a work by Australian, so she's not, you know, she's English speaking, you know, Western educated, etc. But what it struck me when I saw this film is how much it, you know, opens up the opportunities for these new technologies to not just be deployed in a, as it were, fantasy way, but to actually really immerse a claim is made to immerse us in other experiences. And this was one case where it really is true. And I wish we could see a bit more of that.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Andrew, for that question. And our last question today will be from our very own Fong H. Louis. And you should be able to unmute, Fong.
Oh, thank you so much, Margaret. Good to see you again. Thank you. Thank you so much, Tina. Of course, Masinka, Doreen, and Kay, and Clara, and Charlotte for having been this amazing, luminous, exciting, thoughtful guest critic, really. I don't remember I was supposed to have a question, but I will be gladly to ask one because Tina mentioned about experimental film. Early on, you know, I guess she meant works of people like Harris Smith or Brackage. It's just that yesterday we screened for the whole day yesterday for Memorial Day, a new documentary film made about our beloved Jonas Makers. And it struck to me that many artists of that generation, so it go beyond experimental film, but I know how important it was for a lot of avant-garde artists, people including John Jonas, Trista Brown, the dance community, the performing artists, including Richard Serra early on started with experimental film through his introduction especially the work with Michael Snow and Hollis Frampton and others, of course, you know. So my question is that it was deliberate that people of that generation would make works of art that not be consumed that easily. It was their desire to make films or dance as ephemeral as possible. It's not consumable object, you know, whatsoever. So I just wanted to ask you all, the question is that it's a radical attitude when we think about making art in such manner. Would radicality of as a form of thinking be still nurtured today among, you know, as you are talking about history, you know? And shall we start with you, Tina, and then go across briefly?
Yeah.
Anyone?
Sure. So in 2021, at sort of the height of the NFT craze, I wrote an essay for Art Forum about NFTs, and some of what I said, I think, is no longer applicable because the scene has changed, the artists have changed, the platforms have changed, et cetera. But the thing I was initially really upset about was that we were creating a market for digital art that was, for no reason, privileging artworks that are stable objects. When I saw the, you know, and again, I always qualify this comment by saying, like, JPEGs are artworks too. Like, I don't want anybody who makes JPEGs to get mad at me. Like, they count, it's fine. It's just that digital art also includes a lot of other kinds of objects, assets, right? Including works that are networked, that are inherently performative, that are iterative, that aren't sort of stable or unique in some sense, but that actually iterate and are always recreated in different contexts, right? I mean, the whole concept of variable media, right, which was a word that we used to use to talk about time-based media art, and which encompasses not only media-based works, but also performance. So I just felt like all of that work was being sidelined in order to put forward a model of digital art that essentially was modeled on other art forms, right? In the sense that you have this unique object that is not only unique, but static, right? And not interactive and not performative, not dynamic. So yes, it's a problem. It's a huge problem. And I hate to, I'm very self-conscious after today's conversation to bring up a word like radicality, right? But this is precisely what I see is the radical, like, this is what excites me about digital art. I also love artists who make JPEGs, but one of the things I love about digital art is the way that it puts on the table this question of, like, well, what is the thing anyway, right? Like, what is the what? How do we even point to, I mean, even something as simple, I mean, the exhibitions I've curated, like, just trying to come up with the date for a project can be like a philosophical exercise, right? Because of the way that a single project can iterate and manifest across, you know, different contexts, et cetera. So yes, it's challenging because it does require us, whether we're curators or critics or historians, to pay attention to detail and to also come up with new, I mean, even just like from a museum perspective, like our collections database, like we need new flexi fields in order to be able to capture information and talk about these things with any kind of accuracy, right? But this is precisely why I think this field is so exciting.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, I just want to share with you one very funny yet tragic story. When the great Lethal Roth, around early 70s, had no job. No one knew who he was, what he was working on, but he was then making a lot of food art, you know? So my late friend, actually Jonah's best friend, Raymond Abraham, the Austrian architect, who was teaching then in RISD, invited him to teach for a few years. So every weekend he would come and stay with Raymond's loft, you know, in Bond Street. And he would bring him a gift, you know, food in, I don't know, vegetable and food, all kinds of stuff, cheese, and put in the plastic bag. And Raymond over the year have stacked them up, filled the whole entire freezer. One weekend, he had a new housekeeper who come and clean. She throw everything out. And that was the end of Thoreau's 3 years of worth of work. Could you believe it? Anyway, I mean, it does happen. The ephemerality of it all, just like, I left, the Wallace Berkman film that took what, 8 years to make, But anyway, thank you so much. Back to you, Carolyn, I guess.
Sure. Yeah, great. Thank you, Phong, for that question. And yeah, so it's just been such a brilliant conversation, and thank you all for your questions. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm thrilled to welcome our publisher and artistic director, Phong H. Bui, here to the virtual stage. So I'll turn it back to you, Phong.
Thank you again, Carolyn, for the kind introduction. Yeah, I'd be happy to read a poem, and it was beginning of September 2012 when we launched the guest critic page, and it inaugurated with the late art critic poet Bill Bergson, and his guest critic page was so interesting. The assignment was to take up one of the two questions with the hope that such constraint will be illuminating. Either you write about work of art with only physical description, or you write it with a poetic, metaphorical, or philosophical response. But you can't combine the two, I think for the poetic one, he gave the example of the great, of course, Peter Bruegel landscape in the photo Icarus, that WHO make famous, Museum de Beaux-Arts. And for the physical one, he used, I think, a concise review of Donald Judge of a Bonnet Newman citing forth painting. And so anyway, based on that, I wrote, I've been writing poem review since then. And I wrote one on Shirazi last show, not the Guggenheim now, but I only write while I'm there on the spot. So usually it took an hour, and whatever the word comes to me, I was write it down. So here it is. Glowing light at the last breath of day, distant skeletons framing staggering timbers, eco-friendly to planetary nebula, all attesting to divinity and humane intellects, spleens, vessels interstellar, concurrent with degrees of preemptive atrophy and sublimity. Here, digital automatism propagating with dashing elasticity, cartography, optics, astrology, botany, geology, magnetic declination, all infused with material spectrum while attaining a model equilibrium like a North-Shang landscape painting. Thank you.
Amazing, Phong. Thank you so much. What a great poem. Thank you. And thank you to everyone today, to Doreen and Tina, Margaret, Mashinka, Kay, Clara, and Charlotte. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program, making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. For the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through a free monthly publication and public events like our daily NSC. Please check the chat for a link to donate to support the Rail, and join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a flock of poets reading avian works, a Rail reading curated by Nicole Perifit. And you can now turn your microphones on and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
you all so much.
Thank you.
Everyone for joining.
Thank you for
It's
sharing
such
the
a
page
pleasure.
today. And thank you again for your critics page contribution.
Thank you, Rail, for the opportunity. Thank you all.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Great.
Thank you for your reading, Sean.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Yeah, great reading, Sean.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Masika, Doreen.
Everyone. That was incredible.
Looking forward to being in
y'all.
touch.
Thank you. Have an
Bye.
incredible rest of your
Thank
day.
you.
Please keep up the good work. Okay, you all, please. And, see you physically soon in person.
Yes.
Margaret, please come anytime you want.